Okay, hi. It's afternoon for me. I'm springing a surprise on you. I'm varying my lecture titles. Our next lecture is going to be Where is Biodiversity Found? I was looking through the course outline and I realized that we really don't have a lecture going through looking at where biodiversity is mainly found around the world. So I just want to run through this quick lecture in place of the first extinction lecture for the week. So I will do this lecture now, and then the next lecture will be the extinction lecture. Right, so I want to go through where biodiversity is found. I want to take a look at some of the controls on biodiversity, some of the correlations on biodiversity actually, and then some of the suggested reasons why these things control biodiversity. The first is climate and environment. Next we'll take a look at topography and habitat size, geological age, tropical rainforests and coral reefs, which are the two most biodiverse regions on Earth, and then finally take a look at some recently discovered communities on Earth which hold lots and lots of biodiversity. So first of all, climate and environment. It will probably come as no surprise to you that the highest terrestrial diversity is found in warm, rainy, lowland areas. And basically this is like tropical rainforest areas. So tropical rainforest, which are high biodiversity areas, are generally found in warm, rainy lowland areas. Okay, now I'm doing this lecture after I've done the processes lecture, which I probably shouldn't have done. I think you need to look at that processes lecture in the context of this lecture. So take it for granted from me that the highest terrestrial biodiversity tends to be found in warm, rainy lowland areas, such as you would find tropical rainforest in. The highest biodiversity in the world is actually in one of these areas in the western Amazon. This tends to have the maximum species richness for more than one taxa group. As you move away from the warm and the rainy lowland areas, species richness will tend to fall. So species richness tends to fall in drier areas where there's more seasonal or less rainfall, and as temperature falls, as with latitude or altitude. Okay, so the first correlation that we find with high biodiversity is a climactic one. Warm and rainy areas would tend to have the highest biodiversity. Right, the example that I got here is not a tropical one actually. Well, only a part of Australia is in the tropics, the north part, but I'm using this as an example. This is Australia. You probably all recognize it. And these are the different botanical provinces. Australia here is divided up into different botanical provinces, and they are shaded different colors according to the number of species of acacia. Now, acacia is a genus of plants which is found mainly in Australia. There are many different species. In some parts of Australia there are over 100 species in a particular area. So the areas which tend to have the highest numbers of acacia are down here in the south west of Australia, where there is Mediterranean rainfall, and also here down in the southeast and the eastern coast of Australia, where there is rainfall blown in by the trade winds from the tropical regions, and also rainfall coming in from the east from the more temperate regions in the Southern Ocean. So wetter areas, and pretty much all of Australia is quite warm, wetter areas tend to have higher numbers of species of this particular taxa. By the same token, this is species richness, I think, of reptiles in the United States, and the areas with the highest diversity are the higher rainfall areas on the coast, in the tropical Florida area, and also in the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so these are wetter areas. The north can be wetter, but it starts to get quite cold up there. Okay, so wetter and warmer areas tend to have the highest diversity. Right, where else tends to have high diversity? Well, areas diversity can be related to topography and habitat size. First of all, topography. By topography I mean the shape of the land, whether there are hills and valleys, whether there are mountains, whether there are complex drainage patterns and rivers, whether there are short knolls or steep cliffs. A more complex topography tends to have higher levels of species richness. There's some reasons suggested for this. First of all, a more complex topography may divide up populations of species and therefore drive allopatric speciation. Okay, also a more complex topography, and I haven't got it written down here, but I should do, tends to have a greater number of niches for species to specialize in. So, say for instance, a mountainous habitat will have lowland and upland habitat. So two different types of habitat which will allow greater levels of species richness. Okay, I'm going to put that bullet in there because I think it's important. More complex topography has greater number of niches. Okay. All right. And also habitat size has a big influence on biodiversity, and this is most easily demonstrated on islands. So larger islands will tend to have greater species richness. It will tend to have more species. Two reasons are thought to have been proposed for this. First of all, greater area often contains more niches, and secondly, larger areas will mean larger population sizes. And this is one of the fundamental rules of biogeography. Larger areas tend to have greater numbers of species, and this has been proved through many different types of taxa. Here I believe this is birds in the Caribbean. If we look at different island sizes and we plot the log number of species against the log area of islands, you see that it plots along a very satisfactory straight line. So the larger the area, the more species of birds that you will find. Different taxa also reflect this. I know I've done a similar sort of graph for the plants in the Caribbean, and there's this same very satisfactory straight line relationship between the log number of species of plants and the log area of the island. So larger the island, more species you will find. The reason for that is thought to be larger the island, larger populations, lower extinction rates, so a greater build-up of species, and larger the island, more niches are found. So a large island is more likely to have mountainous habitats, for instance, and therefore greater topographic diversity maybe. Okay? Moving on now. Lots of one taxa, lots of all taxa. So this this relationship is basically pointing out that a biodiverse area for one particular taxa, say for instance for the trees, quite often has a high number of species or high species richness for many different taxa. Okay, so for instance, if you have an area where there's a high species richness of trees, you're quite often going to find that there's a high species richness of birds, or a high species richness of butterflies, or a high species richness of understory shrubs. So high species richness in one taxa in a region is often mirrored in other taxa. So the same regions in the Amazon basin often have the highest number of species in most taxa. At smaller scales, you may find that taxa favor different habitats. So for instance, you may find that one set of taxa, like the fish, will obviously inhabit freshwater stream habitats, whereas the birds would tend to inhabit the terra firma forests. Okay, but even though they are in different habitats but within the same area, they still reflect that high species richness. So there'll be high species richness of birds and also high species richness of fish. At a global scale, the areas of highest diversity within a tropical biome may actually be different. Okay? What does that mean? At a global scale, the areas of highest diversity within a tropical biome may be different. So, for instance, in a tropical rainforest, you may find that diversity for... Actually, I'm not too sure what that means. We'll forget about that. But let's look at the example of the Amazon basin, where we have amphibians, birds, and we see that the area which has the highest diversity of amphibians, frogs and such like, also has the highest diversity of birds as well. You also get a tick up of diversity in the Guyana Shield there for amphibians. It's also a high diversity area for birds as well. Okay, it's interesting that high diversity area for birds in Roraima in Brazil is not actually a high diversity area for amphibians, and that could be because this area is much more open to fires and so on. So if we plot those as a heat map, the number of groups which are have the highest diversity centers, we can see that the Western Amazon is one of the highest diversity centers in the world. Okay. Right, so there you go. Some correlations. Let's move on now to some of the highest diversity biomes or regions in the world. Okay. The first is tropical rainforest. The second is coral reefs, which is also very high diversity. Practically all taxa have higher numbers of species in the tropical rainforests. So from birds to butterflies to mammals, there are more species of animals or taxa or plants in a tropical rainforest than there is in the temperate regions. Okay? So much so that rainforests occupy 7% of the land area, but they contain 50% of the species, or at least of insects. 40% of the world's vascular plants in 7% of the land area, and 30% of the world's bird species. So rainforests are very highly biodiverse, and they contain the highest diversity on the planet of many different plant plant and animal taxa. So here we have the species numbers of vascular plants. So the red would tend to be the highest, and the green and yellow will be the lowest. So the highest levels of biodiversity, as you can see, tend to be consistently found in the tropical regions of the world for species number of vascular plants, okay, within the tropics. There are a few areas where there are high rates of diversity outside the tropics. So for instance, in southwest and Western Australia, southern Africa here, and up here in southern China, also a very high diversity. But everywhere else, Mexico, the Amazon Basin, the Congo Basin, West Africa, Southeast Asia, New Guinea, and Indochina are all very high biodiversity areas, and they are all within the tropics. So these are usually areas of tropical rainforest. So tropical rainforests tend to be foci of high species richness, and there is only a few extra tropical areas outside the tropics, which have high diversity species richness. The next type of ecosystem which has very high biodiversity are coral reefs. Now, coral reefs don't the highest diversity marine ecosystems, but they still do not have the same amount of species diversity as terrestrial ecosystems. However, as we've seen from previous lectures, coral reefs also have very high higher level taxa, say at phyla level, than terrestrial ecosystems. So coral reefs, to put that in perspective, the Great Barrier Reef, with 0.1% of the area of the ocean, has 8% of the world's fish species. So fish species massively overrepresented in the Great Barrier Reef. 2,000 species of fish in Great Britain, and 250 on the Atlantic seaboard. 2,000 species of fish in the Great Barrier Reef. GBR is Great Barrier Reef, and 250 on the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. So an order of magnitude higher on the Great Barrier Reef. There is far higher productivity on coral reefs compared to other marine ecosystems, mainly because they're shallow and they quite often have access to nutrients from land sources. They are, but not too much nutrients. And coral reef species are far more widely distributed than rainforest species. So this is probably why coral reef species richness tends to be lower than terrestrial species richness, because coral reef species will tend to disperse over much wider ranges, and so they have a much broader distribution. Okay, because they have a much broader distribution, because part of their life cycle involves drifting around the ocean for a few months before they finally encounter a correct habitat and settle. The coral reef species are more widely distributed, and so in any one area there were fewer species. Okay, and the communities tend to be more similar over wider areas than in rainforests. Alright, to put this into context, the number of fish species versus latitude can be seen here. Okay, so these are the ranges of diversity in different places. So the ranges of diversity of fish species, the Philippines ranges over, say, about 10 degrees of latitude, and they have the highest number of fish species. The Western Caribbean ranges also over about 10 degrees latitude, and they have about 600. Okay. More temperate ecosystems like Greenland, for instance, ranges over quite a large range of latitude but has very few species. So the more temperate ecosystems out here on the arms of this bell-shaped curve will tend to have lower biodiversity of fish species than the tropical ecosystems, more in the tropics. Okay? Make sense? Alright. So, we see that rainforests are some of the most highly diverse species-rich ecosystems on Earth, and they are actually some of the frontiers for biodiversity exploration. In particular, areas which have not been easy to get to, such as the rainforest canopy, many new species are being found, and these are species of animals or even plants which never descend to the forest floor. So if you wander around in the forest, you have no idea that they're there. Okay? So these areas, these rainforest canopies are difficult to get to. Okay? Scientists previously just wandered around on the forest floor, but they're discovering that much of the diversity of a tropical rainforest can actually be found up in the rainforest canopy. So new and different methods of getting up into the rainforest canopy are being used. I've seen pictures of blimps which cart around a net which scientists would sit in and sample as it's lowered down onto the canopy of the rainforest. Construction cranes are being set up in the middle of the rainforest so that scientists can access the canopy or within the range of this construction crane. So these types of techniques, and using a single rope technique where a line is shot up into the canopy using a slingshot, and a climbing rope is hauled over a branch, and people are able to ascend into the canopy by climbing these ropes. All of these techniques are revealing that there are many more species, particularly of insects, but also of plants and other species up in the canopy which people never knew existed. Another frontier of biodiversity exploration is the deep sea floor. Dredging and drilling operations show that there is high species diversity in bacteria and nematodes on the deep ocean floor. The reason for that is thought to be because of the stability of the ecosystem, which allows intense niche packing and specialization by many different species. Another biodiversity is at a microscopic level, fungal endophytes. Fungal endophytes are fungal species which live inside of plants, and in particular inside the leaves of trees in the tropics. It's been found that, or it's been estimated that a single leaf of a tree may have 4, 5, up to 10 different species of fungi, all living within the leaf of that tree, not harming it, just living alongside the leaf. Okay, so that if you want to work out the diversity of the fungi in a forest, okay, if any of those fungi are specialists, you would need to multiply the number of tree species in the forest by the number of fungi that you would find there. Okay, so specialist fungi that you would find there. So there may actually be far more fungal endophytes than there are species of trees in the tropics, which would massively increase the number of species found on this planet. So a couple of pictures. Here's that canopy crane that I was telling you about. I believe this is in Panama. So the canopy crane, the construction crane, would be able to swing all the way around in this canopy, and look, there's the gondola, So scientists would sit in that gondola, and the crane would, so if they wanted to investigate this canopy here, the crane would be able to swing around, put the gondola out to the end, and they would be able to investigate this canopy. So species like this bromeliad up in the canopy can be studied in detail, and we can see whether it's a new and different species. Scientists are also able to find species at ground level. In this case, they bring the canopy species to them by spraying insecticide into the canopy and catching all the dead insects as they die and fall off the branch with sheets, and they gather all those specimens together, and the many thousands which are found have to be identified and, if necessary, described scientifically if they are a new species. At the bottom of the deep blue sea, these are different types of nematodes. As you can see, they're fairly small, but because of their stable environment, there are many of them. These nematodes, or mollusks, certainly arthropods, and other types of fungal endophytes, okay, which can be found in multiple species, all occurring in the same leaf of a particular tree. So, as you can see, that there is frontiers, or where people are still counting the number of species. So how many species are there? Are we going to have to wait until we describe every species on Earth before we know how many species there are? Well, we're actually fighting against the clock, because as we will see in the next lecture, there are many parts of the world where habitat is being destroyed, and many different species are driven to extinction without us even knowing that they're there. So we're trying to estimate the total numbers of species on Earth by using predictive methods such as extrapolation methods. For instance, estimating the numbers of an unknown taxa in one area, in a known area, and scaling up. Okay. So for instance, we can go to a hectare of forest and intensively study all the species of this particular taxa in that 1 hectare, and then just assume that the density of species that we find in that 1 hectare is constant across all the similar habitat. So we go to a hectare of rainforest, estimate that there are 1,000 species of beetle in that hectare, and we estimate that there may be 10% or 50% of those species which are only found in that hectare. So we can multiply up to estimate how many species of beetle there are in the entire rainforest. Okay? We can also use another extrapolation by looking at known ratios between taxa in well-studied areas. For instance, the ratio of fungi to plants in Britain is about 6 to 1. There's 6 fungal species for every plant species in Britain. Okay? If plants in tropical areas are relatively well described and fungi is not well described, from this ratio or this relationship, maybe there is 6 times as many fungi in a tropical rainforest than there is plant species. So if we estimate that there is, say, 150,000 plant species in the rainforest, will there be, 900,000 species of fungi in the tropical rainforest using this known ratio method? So there's a brief glimpse into some of the areas where biodiversity is found around the world, which sorts of ecosystems, and what are the characteristics of those ecosystems. So the next lecture will be on extinction, and we will see how we are losing this biodiversity today.